When Bianca staggered out from the edge of the desert near Apache Junction, on a dry, scorching Arizona morning, she was barely recognizable, gaunt to the bone, clothes caked with sand and dust, and eyes vacant, as if she had forgotten the outside world existed. The girl who had vanished 4 years earlier in the Superstition Mountains, where desperate searches had eventually closed with a cold case file, had suddenly reappeared in a condition no one could explain. But what unsettled the medical personnel and police wasn't just Bianca's emaciated body or her unnerving silence. The most terrifying part was the fragments of memory she carried with her from those 4 years. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the latest cases. On the morning of April 14, 2018, the gravel parking lot near the trailhead of a little marked route in the Superstition Mountains area of Arizona carried an unusually quiet atmosphere when Bianca closed her car door for the last time before heading out. The 16-year-old girl, raised in Phoenix in a familiar urban environment where daily movement meant paved roads, signs, and steady cell service, saw this short day hike as a small test of her independence rather than a daring adventure. According to those present at the parking lot that morning, Bianca appeared alone, without any companions, equipped appropriately for a day hike, no tent or overnight gear, exactly matching the plan she had clearly explained to her family before leaving home. Bianca's intended route was simply to head a few hours into the mountains, rest at a high vantage point, then turn back the same way and return to Phoenix before dark, a plan considered completely normal for young people familiar with outdoor activity in Arizona. Bianca left the parking lot late in the morning, moving in the planned direction, and during the first few hours, nothing suggested this trip would be any different from the hundreds of other short hikes that had taken place in the Superstition Mountains. The last confirmed contact occurred in the early afternoon, when Bianca sent a short, simple, neutral message to her family. No mention of difficulties, no expression of worry, no indication of changing route or return time, and after that moment, her phone registered no further signal. As time passed and Bianca failed to appear at the expected time, her family initially thought she might just be delayed by the steep rocky terrain, intense heat, or the spotty cell coverage common in the Superstition Mountains, where mobile devices frequently lose connection without warning. However, as afternoon turned to dusk, and still no call or message came from Bianca, the waiting began to carry a sharp sense of unease. Calls were made repeatedly with no answer, messages sent went without delivered status, and no information from friends or acquaintances indicated that Bianca had left the mountain area. Given that the Superstition Mountains had long been known as a place where even a small mistake in direction or timing could lead to dangerous situations, Bianca's family had to face the possibility that the day trip had not gone according to the original plan. When darkness fell completely and Bianca still had not returned, the worry was no longer an assumption, it had become an emergency, and the family made the decision to contact local authorities to report Bianca missing, providing the last known contact time, planned route, and basic identifying details. At the time the missing person file was officially opened, only one single fact was recorded in the initial documents: a 16-year-old girl had entered the Superstition Mountains area on a day plan and had not returned. After Bianca's missing person file was opened, the initial response took place within her family, where worry quickly turned into a prolonged state of tension, as no one could provide a reasonable explanation for how a day trip ended in complete silence. Bianca's family provided police with all the information they had, from the time she left home, the pre-stated travel plan, to the content of the last message showing no signs of abnormality, while also beginning to review on their own every possible scenario that could have led to her not returning on time. Information about a 16-year-old girl missing in the Superstition Mountains quickly spread through the local community via police briefings, social media, and neighborhood groups around the Phoenix area, creating an initial wave of attention, but not yet accompanied by panic, because in the general perception, getting lost or encountering minor issues during a day hike were still seen as situations that could happen and were usually resolved in a short time. Authorities issued a missing person alert with a basic description of Bianca, calling on anyone present in the Superstition Mountains area during the relevant time period to contact them if they had information, but in the first hours and days, no calls provided direct or reliable leads about sightings of Bianca after the last contact time. The natural features of the area quickly became the focus of the initial assessment, as the Superstition Mountains are known for complex terrain, with steep rocky slopes, narrow canyons, many unmarked trails, and stretches of landscape that can easily disorient those unfamiliar with it. The time of Bianca's disappearance fell during a seasonal weather transition period, where days could be hot and sunny, but temperatures dropped quickly in the late afternoon, while some mountain areas could experience strong winds and prolonged shade, making heat retention and water supply critical factors for hikers. These conditions were viewed by the officers receiving the report as sufficient to explain the possibility that Bianca had difficulty returning to the parking lot on the expected schedule, especially given the frequently unstable mobile signals in the area that disrupted communication and made calling for help difficult. During the initial information intake process, no direct witnesses were identified as having seen Bianca in distress, deviating from the planned route, or interacting with strangers in the area, and scattered reports from other hikers only confirmed the general presence of day visitors that day without providing specific details related to Bianca. The complete lack of witnesses meant the file could not form a clear sequence of events after the last contact time, forcing initial assessments to rely almost entirely on assumptions about natural conditions and common risks of the mountainous environment. More importantly, there were no signs suggesting criminal activity, no information about conflicts, threats, or disputes before the trip, no reports of cries for help, struggles, or suspicious vehicles in the parking lot area, and no evidence indicating Bianca had encountered anyone other than the anonymous strangers present in the mountain area at the same time. These factors meant authorities had no basis yet to consider the case from a criminal angle, and in the first internal assessments, the possibility that Bianca had encountered trouble on her own due to getting lost, fatigue, dehydration, or misjudging the terrain conditions was still regarded as the most reasonable hypothesis. Meanwhile, the local community, though concerned and sharing information about the disappearance, had not yet developed a mindset of fear or suspicion of human danger, because all available data pointed to a familiar scenario that had occurred in the Superstition Mountains in the past. Bianca's family, while not ruling out any possibilities, still had to face the reality that they had no specific leads to hold on to, no clear investigative direction, and no criminal hypothesis formally proposed, only anxious waiting in a context where nature and terrain were seen as the only explanation for their daughter's disappearance. After the initial intake yielded no specific leads, authorities officially launched a search and rescue operation in the Superstition Mountains with the goal of locating Bianca or any signs indicating her direction of travel after the last confirmed contact. The search was organized according to the standard structure for missing persons in mountainous terrain, involving local rescue teams, county search and rescue specialists, Arizona State Park rangers, and trained civilian volunteers familiar with desert landscapes. The initial search area was delineated based on the planned route provided by the family, the main trails, and the common side paths that day hikers typically choose, then gradually expanded to include canyons, rocky slopes, and more remote, difficult-to-access terrain. Helicopters were deployed for aerial sweeps during optimal daylight hours, while ground teams moved in formation to thoroughly check high-risk areas such as steep drop-offs, narrow ravines, and long-shaded sections where someone weakened or disoriented might take shelter. Cadaver and trailing dogs were brought in to search for scent, but their effectiveness was limited by the dry, rocky terrain, strong winds, and prior foot traffic in the area before Bianca's disappearance, which quickly scattered and contaminated any scent trails. During the search, teams noted numerous environmental hazards that could endanger an underprepared hiker, including rapid day-to-night temperature swings, scarce natural water sources, and sections prone to slips and falls, yet no discoveries indicated a major accident had occurred at the inspected locations. After days of continuous sweeping, search personnel located several personal items confirmed to belong to Bianca, scattered within an area close to her intended route, items consistent with a day hike, and showing no signs of deliberate destruction or hasty abandonment. These items were documented, collected and processed according to protocol, but their relatively intact condition and dispersed placement prevented authorities from establishing a clear scenario of an on-site mishap. More importantly, at the locations where the personal items were found, there were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of dragging or physical confrontation, and no indication of vehicles or tools that might suggest violence. These findings reinforced the initial assessment that if Bianca had encountered trouble, it was far more likely to have been caused by natural environmental factors than by human intervention. As the search perimeter continued to expand without producing new leads, the search and rescue teams began confronting the practical limits of resources and time, especially in the absence of any clear indicators to focus efforts on a particular zone. Internal review meetings were held to compile collected data, compare it with similar missing persons cases that had previously occurred in the Superstition Mountains, and in the preliminary conclusion reports, the hypothesis that Bianca became lost, disoriented, or incapacitated in a way that prevented her from returning to the planned route remained the scenario best supported by the available evidence. The absence of a body, lack of signs of serious accident, and no clear criminal elements meant the case could not be transitioned to a criminal investigation, while also imposing legal constraints on maintaining a large-scale active search effort over an extended period. After active search operations were scaled back and shifted to periodic checks, Bianca's file was administratively reclassified from an active ongoing search case to a cold case status, with the possibility of reopening should new information emerge. This decision, though technical and based on objective criteria, marked the point at which the matter was no longer treated as an emergency situation, but became an unsolved disappearance, joining the many similar files long associated with the harsh terrain of the Superstition Mountains. At the time the administrative conclusion was recorded, there was no basis for filing criminal charges, no suspects, and no hypothesis that extended beyond the framework of accident or becoming lost in the wilderness, causing the case to gradually slip into what authorities term a cold file, awaiting a new element strong enough to fundamentally alter the initial understanding of Bianca's disappearance. 4 years after Bianca's missing person file was classified as a cold case and no longer treated as an emergency situation, an unexpected event occurred in the area on the outskirts of the town of Apache Junction, where sparse local roads gradually transitioned into the dry, barren desert terrain leading into the Superstition Mountains. On an early morning, when the roadside service shops had just begun to open and foot traffic was still very light, a young woman emerged from the edge of the desert, moving slowly with a frail and unsteady posture that initially made those who saw her unsure whether she needed help or was simply someone who had gotten lost. She had no means of transportation, carried no backpack, purse, or any personal belongings. Her clothes were dirty and torn, unsuitable for the nearby urban environment or the normal living conditions of a teenager in the area. As people approached closer, they noticed that the young woman's physical condition was clearly abnormal, with an emaciated frame, rough dry skin, exhausted eyes, and slow responses to simple questions, indicating prolonged exhaustion, rather than the result of a single sleepless night or an overly strenuous few-hour hike. She was taken to a nearby medical facility for initial health assessment, and there, medical staff quickly determined that her condition required emergency-level handling, even though there were no signs of recent injury or a just-occurred accident. Vital signs showed her body was in a state of severe malnutrition, prolonged dehydration, and signs of metabolic disturbance, factors that typically only appear after an extended period of living under deprivation conditions, not consistent with short-term disorientation in a natural environment. During intake, the girl was unable to provide any clear identifying information, could not confirm her name, age, place of residence, or the most recent time she could accurately remember, and frequently paused between answers with long silences. as if trying to piece together fragmented memories. When asked how she had arrived at Apache Junction, or where she had been before, her reactions fluctuated between confusion, bewilderment, and incomplete responses that did not form a verifiable sequence of events. Her disorientation was evident not only in her inability to orient to time and place, but also in the way she reacted to the surrounding social environment, normal sounds, the approach of multiple people, or rapid-fire questions caused her noticeable tension, forcing medical staff to minimize stimuli as much as possible and proceed with extreme caution. The complete lack of identification documents or any items that could verify her identity meant she was temporarily recorded as an unidentified patient, and in those first hours, the top priority was stabilizing her physical condition and monitoring physiological responses before proceeding with further verification steps. However, even during the initial medical handling phase, doctors and nurses all observed that her state did not match typical cases of wanderers or individuals who had recently experienced a short-term incident, because the degree of debilitation and the survival adaptation signs on her body suggested an unusually prolonged living circumstance. Throughout the initial care period, the girl did not voluntarily recount any story about herself, offered no explanation for her appearance, and was unable to provide a coherent narrative when questioned, causing all efforts to gather information to stall at objective observations of her current condition. The combination of severe physical debilitation, profound psychological disorientation, and the total absence of documents or personal items led the medical team to conclude that this was not merely a routine medical care case, but a situation potentially involving factors beyond the scope of medicine. Following standard protocol, medical personnel notified local authorities, providing initial information about her health status, circumstances of appearance, and the abnormal signs recorded, while emphasizing that the girl was currently incapable of explaining herself or her situation. The notification was made cautiously, without any assumptions about the cause or nature of the incident, as all collected data was still insufficient to draw conclusions. At the time this information was handed over, the only thing that could be stated with certainty was the appearance of a young woman in severely debilitated condition at the edge of the Superstition Mountains, stepping out from an area long associated with numerous unsolved missing persons files, carrying no documents or identifying markers, unable to recount her identity or the journey she had endured, and leaving no clear clue to explain why she had appeared in Apache Junction, after a long period during which she had been completely unrecorded in any system. It was precisely that gap in identity and history that pushed the situation beyond the scope of a routine emergency case. Immediately after authorities received the official notification from the medical facility in Apache Junction regarding the presence of an unidentified girl in severe debilitation and unable to provide any personal information herself, the identity verification process was activated, according to the standard protocol for long-term missing persons cases involving high-risk factors, marking the transition from emergency medical handling to a systematic legal and investigative verification process. The first step carried out was fingerprint collection, a technical procedure that allows direct comparison with national and state databases without relying on the patient's cooperation or awareness. The fingerprint samples were taken under controlled medical conditions to avoid causing additional stress to the girl, then sent to the central storage system for matching against existing records. While awaiting results, the medical team continued close monitoring of her biological condition, while also documenting basic physical characteristics, such as height, body structure, and any long-term marks that could assist with identification. When the fingerprint comparison results came back, the data showed a match with a missing persons file opened 4 years earlier in Phoenix, Arizona, under the name Bianca, who had disappeared in the Superstition Mountains area and had never been located during prior search operations. Although this result carried high reliability, authorities still proceeded with additional independent verification steps to rule out any possibility of error, data duplication, or technical mistake. Bianca's pre-disappearance medical records were retrieved from healthcare facilities in Phoenix, including information on medical history, prior medical interventions, and stable physiological characteristics over time. These records were compared with the current condition of the unidentified girl, focusing on unchangeable factors such as blood type, bone structure, and specific biological markers, which showed clear compatibility between the two sets of records. In parallel, Bianca's dental records were used as a highly accurate means of confirmation, with comparisons made between the number of teeth, jaw shape, orthodontic or treatment signs previously recorded, and the current dental structure of the girl. The dental comparison results further reinforced the hypothesis that the unidentified girl was indeed Bianca, as the matching features were consistent with no significant discrepancies. Beyond technical methods, other identifying characteristics noted in the original missing persons file, including old scars, birthmarks, and distinctive physical traits, were also examined and confirmed on the girl's body, creating a tightly linked chain of evidence connecting the current data to the file established 4 years earlier. Once the technical verification steps reached the required level of certainty, authorities contacted Bianca's family to carry out the final confirmation step, while simultaneously preparing them psychologically and arranging appropriate contact conditions to minimize any negative impact on both the victim and her loved ones. The family, after years of living in a state of unanswered waiting, was invited to the medical facility at a point when the verification data was nearly complete, and the in-person identification took place in a controlled environment with medical staff and law enforcement representatives present. The match in appearance, voice, and familiar reactions, despite being overlaid by debilitation and psychological changes, conclusively confirmed that the unidentified girl was Bianca. This confirmation was formally recorded in the relevant documents, concluding the identification process and completely eliminating any possibility of mistaken identity. Immediately afterward, Bianca was placed under special medical protection protocols, including restricted contact with unauthorized individuals, controlled handling of personal information, and a stable treatment environment, with priority given to physical recovery and preventing additional psychological stress following identification. These measures also served to safeguard Bianca's legal rights, given that the circumstances of her reappearance remained unclear and could involve complex factors. At the same time, the status of Bianca's missing persons file was updated in the authorities' management system, changing from cold case status to active case status, reflecting the reality that the missing person had been located alive and had reappeared under unusual conditions. Reopening the file carried clear administrative significance, but at this point, it remained limited to recording the change in case status, without any conclusions yet drawn about the cause or context of the prolonged disappearance, as all evaluations were temporarily suspended to focus on protecting Bianca's health and safety. After Bianca's identity was confirmed, and she was placed under medical protection, doctors began an in-depth forensic medical evaluation process, aimed at determining not only her current health status, but also tracing back what her body had endured over a prolonged period. The initial focus of this process was the malnutrition condition, identified not as acute, but as chronic and long-term, evidenced by a body mass index significantly lower than expected for her age and height, pronounced muscle atrophy in major muscle groups, reduced bone density, and biochemical markers showing long-term deficiencies in protein, vitamins, and minerals. These signs were inconsistent with the scenario of a teenager lost in the wilderness for a few days or weeks, instead indicating a systematic extended deprivation process lasting many months or years, during which caloric and nutrient intake was kept at the bare minimum necessary to sustain life. In parallel with the nutritional assessment, doctors noted numerous old untreated injuries on Bianca's body, including faint scars on her arms and legs, signs of healed soft tissue trauma under conditions without medical intervention, and minor deformities in certain joints, suggesting past injuries that were not properly immobilized or rehabilitated. These injuries did not bear the characteristics of a single accident occurring in a mountainous environment, but reflected repeated incidents over time, each leaving small traces that accumulated into an overall picture of living without basic medical care. Particularly, the musculoskeletal evaluation revealed clear limitations in Bianca's range of motion in certain joints, along with muscle weakness and postural imbalance, indicating she had gone through a prolonged period of restricted movement, not complete immobility, like being bedridden, but rather being prevented from or lacking the conditions for free movement. These manifestations were consistent with being forced to function within a confined space, with repetitive activities, and a lack of the diverse movement necessary for normal physical development during adolescence. Functional tests showed that Bianca's body had developed physiological adaptation mechanisms to prolonged deprivation conditions, including lowered resting heart rate, stably low blood pressure adjustment, and metabolic changes aimed at conserving energy, responses that typically only appear when the body must adapt to prolonged food scarcity and survival stress. While these adaptations help sustain life, they also left long-term consequences for health, especially in a body still in the developmental stage. When compiling the medical data, doctors compared it to common scenarios in missing persons cases related to natural environments, particularly the hypothesis that Bianca had been lost in the Superstition Mountains. They pointed out that in cases of prolonged wilderness survival where the victim still lived, there were usually distinctly different signs, such as injuries from intense sun exposure or acute hypothermia, characteristic abrasions from continuous movement through dense terrain, and a pattern of debilitation that did not show the stable physiological adaptations seen in Bianca. Additionally, a person lost in the wilderness for an extended time would typically have to move constantly to find water, food, and an escape route, leading to signs of overuse injuries and exertion-related trauma, contrary to what was recorded on Bianca's body, where the evidence pointed toward restricted movement and activity within a fixed space. Doctors also noted the absence of severe environmental injury signs typical of the harsh desert, such as heavy sunburn, prolonged sun exposure, skin damage, or wounds from the area's characteristic thorny vegetation, which further weakened the hypothesis of a prolonged lost-in-the-wilderness scenario without human intervention. When the medical evaluations were compiled into an official report, the conclusion was stated cautiously, but clearly: Bianca's health condition could not reasonably be explained solely by natural environmental factors or a single accident, but showed signs of a long-term controlled living conditions process. Although the medical report did not draw conclusions about the identity or motives of any individuals involved, it identified a key orienting factor: Bianca had lived under systematic deprivation, with prolonged restricted movement and lack of medical care, characteristics consistent with confinement in a human-controlled environment, rather than a random natural incident. This conclusion, recorded in the living forensic medical file, was not intended to replace investigative assessments, but played a pivotal role in completely ruling out the lost-in-the-wilderness hypothesis and establishing that Bianca's prolonged disappearance was linked to a deliberate form of long-term confinement, thereby laying a solid scientific foundation for re-examining the entire nature of the case beyond the initial administrative conclusions. Once the medical evidence demonstrated that Bianca's physical condition could not have formed from an accident or spontaneous survival scenario in a natural environment, the focus of analysis was forced to shift to the field of forensic psychology. On that basis, the psychological evaluation process was implemented cautiously and under controlled conditions, with the goal of documenting the mental responses formed over a long period of control and comparing them to established patterns in cases of prolonged confinement, in order to clarify the mechanisms of trauma that cannot be observed through physical traces alone. From the very first contact sessions, psychologists noted that Bianca exhibited many characteristics consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a form of PTSD that commonly appears in individuals subjected to continuous, unending stress with no clear endpoint and no ability to escape the source of harm. Unlike acute PTSD tied to a single event, Bianca's responses indicated a history of prolonged trauma, with a gradual erosion of her sense of personal safety and self-agency. During structured assessment sessions, Bianca had difficulty maintaining a continuous train of thought, frequently disconnecting from the present in brief moments, a phenomenon documented as dissociation, where the mind detaches from real-time experience as a protective mechanism developed through extended psychological pressure. This was not dramatic or explosive, but occurred quietly, with vacant stares, gradually softening voice, and slowed responses, indicating it was not a temporary reaction to a recent incident, but a state that had become internalized. Psychologists also clearly observed submissive reflexes in the way Bianca answered questions. She tended to seek approval before speaking, often pausing to wait for confirmation that her response was acceptable, and avoided offering personal opinions or contradicting anything suggested. This reflex was accompanied by avoidant behavior, shown through her tendency to avoid direct eye contact, especially in situations involving authority figures or when questions touched on deeply personal experiences. In assessment situations where adult males were present, Bianca's fearful reactions became more pronounced, with physiological signs such as increased heart rate, body tension, altered breathing patterns, and a tendency to shrink inward, even when no threatening actions or pressured language were used. Psychologists noted that this response was not person-specific, but appeared consistently in the presence of adult male figures, indicating a conditioned reflex formed from repeated past experiences. Upon deeper analysis of behavioral patterns, the evaluation team observed that Bianca tended to adjust her behavior to avoid conflict to the maximum extent, complying with small requests almost automatically, and displaying heightened vigilance toward any changes in tone or body language from the person she was interacting with. These traits aligned with research on victims of long-term psychological control, where compliance is no longer a conscious choice, but becomes a survival reflex reinforced over time. Notably, Bianca was unable to coherently describe the events that occurred during the entire period she was missing, not because she was deliberately concealing or refusing to cooperate, but because her memories were fragmented, with large gaps and disjointed pieces that could not be connected into a logical sequence. Experts assessed this as a common consequence of complex trauma, in which the brain prioritizes survival by isolating overwhelming emotional experiences, leading to disruptions in the encoding and retrieval of memories. When comparing these psychological manifestations to hypothetical scenarios, the evaluation group ruled out the possibility that Bianca's responses were merely the result of prolonged wilderness disorientation or solitary survival in a natural environment, as such cases typically involve different manifestations, such as increased self-reliance, heightened alertness toward the natural surroundings rather than people, and intense focus on survival skills. In contrast, Bianca's reactions centered on reading human behavior, avoiding drawing attention, and maintaining safety through compliance, a psychological pattern tied to living under someone else's control. The Forensic Psychological Evaluation Report, compiled based on multiple contact sessions and standardized assessment tools, did not draw conclusions about the identity or motives of any individuals involved, but established an important finding. Bianca's psychological state reflected a history of prolonged psychological control, with elements of fear, submission, and memory fragmentation consistent with cases of long-term unlawful confinement. When placed alongside the medical conclusions regarding her physical condition, this finding strongly reinforced the suspicion that Bianca's prolonged disappearance was not the result of a random series of accidents, but was directly related to intentional human behavior, creating a solid scientific and psychological foundation for examining the case from a criminal perspective, rather than continuing to maintain the administrative assumptions originally formed in the missing persons file. After the medical and forensic psychological evaluations determined that Bianca was not capable of providing a statement according to standard procedural requirements, the investigating authorities completely adjusted their approach, treating whatever Bianca could say not as testimony to be checked for truth or falsehood, but as raw data reflecting her psychological experiences and living conditions throughout the period of her disappearance. The sessions were conducted in a tightly controlled environment, kept short in duration, with no goal of reconstructing the sequence of events or forcing Bianca to answer leading questions. Instead, specialists allowed Bianca to say whatever came into her consciousness, no matter how fragmented, incomplete, or repetitive, and the receiving team's task was to accurately record each detail as an independent unit of data. From the very first contact sessions, experts observed that Bianca's memories existed in the form of disconnected fragments of experience, not linked together into a continuous timeline, with fleeting images, bodily sensations, and emotional states surfacing and then vanishing without any clear order. When asked about time, Bianca could not determine how much time had passed between memory fragments, could not distinguish day from night or one season from another, indicating that her ability to orient to time had been systematically disrupted. Experts noted that this loss of time perception was consistent with cases of individuals living in prolonged controlled environments, where natural time cues such as light, daily routines, or social interactions were restricted or manipulated. Similarly, when referring to location, Bianca could not name places, determine directions, distances, or any specific geographic landmarks, but only described recurring features such as enclosed space, dim lighting, the monotony of the environment, and a sense of being cut off from the outside world. These descriptions were insufficient to pinpoint a specific location, but held significant value when analyzed as data about the type of living space Bianca had become familiar with over a long period. Throughout the recording process, the specialized team paid particular attention to analyzing keywords and phrases that repeatedly appeared in Bianca's accounts, regardless of her inability to place them in a specific context or sequence. Words related to waiting, silence, movement restrictions, following rules, and the presence of an unnamed controlling figure appeared with high frequency, indicating these were core elements that shaped her experience. These keywords were separated from emotional content and analyzed as qualitative data, allowing experts to identify recurring patterns of living conditions and control behaviors, rather than attempting to infer specific details that might be distorted by trauma. An important principle established throughout this process was not to use Bianca's accounts as direct evidence in any legal proceedings, because the fragmentation of memory, lack of time markers, and absence of geographic references meant the information did not meet legal standards for accuracy, verifiability, and consistency. This was clearly documented in internal reports to ensure Bianca was not placed in a position of having to defend or prove her statements, while also avoiding the risk of distorting the investigation if unverified details were misused. Instead, all data collected from Bianca's accounts was fed into an analysis system aimed at constructing hypothetical models of the prolonged confinement and control process. Experts combined this data with medical conclusions regarding malnutrition, movement restriction, and physiological adaptations, as well as psychological assessments of submissive reflexes and dissociation, to cross-reference which elements consistently repeated between her subjective experience and objective evidence. Through this method, Bianca's fragmented accounts, though unable to establish specific times or places, still played a crucial role in outlining the structure of a controlled living environment, where factors such as monotony, limited contact, and the sustained presence of authority were maintained over a long period. This approach also reflected a fundamental shift in investigative thinking. The focus was no longer on forcing the victim to recall a complete story to serve prosecutorial needs, but on extracting the latent informational value in whatever she could remember, however fragmented and incomplete. Treating her statements as data allowed authorities to protect Bianca from the psychological pressure of interrogation, while still utilizing key information to guide subsequent analytical steps. In the compiled reports, what Bianca provided was not presented as a coherent narrative, but was coded and organized into thematic groups and recurring patterns, focusing on stable elements that persisted throughout the experience, rather than isolated events. This handling allowed Bianca's accounts to be used as an analytical data source, contributing to the construction of a model of prolonged confinement by reflecting a system of living conditions and control mechanisms that had persistently impacted the victim's perception and memory over many years, rather than pinpointing a specific timeline or behavior. When these results were placed alongside the findings from the living forensic medical evaluation and forensic psychological assessment, the overall picture of the case began to reveal clear contradictions with the initial assumptions. From that point of intersection, after all the new data had been systematized and standardized, authorities conducted a comprehensive review of Bianca's missing persons file, aiming to compare the previous administrative conclusions with the current evidence and reassess the reasonableness of the hypotheses that had once been accepted. This process was not merely an update of information, but a complete reevaluation of the entire logic that had previously guided the case, particularly the hypothesis that Bianca had suffered an accident or become lost in the Superstition Mountains. Investigators cross-referenced each old conclusion in detail with the new data, starting with Bianca's current physical condition, which showed prolonged malnutrition, systematic movement restriction, and specific physiological adaptations, factors completely incompatible with the survival model of someone lost in a desert environment. When compared to documented cases of prolonged wilderness disorientation, where victims typically exhibited signs of continuous movement, exertion-related injuries, sun exposure skin damage, or characteristic abrasions from rugged terrain, Bianca's file revealed fundamental differences, creating a direct contradiction with the once accepted accident hypothesis. In parallel with comparing the medical and psychological data, investigators reanalyzed all of Bianca's personal items that had been collected during previous search operations, including the locations where they were found, their state of preservation, and the surrounding environmental context at the time of discovery. These items, which had previously been regarded as evidence supporting the lost in the wilderness hypothesis, were now placed within a new analytical framework, with the focus on determining whether they truly reflected a natural incident or could fit a different scenario. The fact that the items were found in an undamaged state showed no signs of prolonged emergency use and were not associated with any survival traces, such as temporary shelters or nearby water sources, led investigators to question how they had appeared at the recorded locations. When cross-referenced with the medical data showing that Bianca exhibited no signs of long-term survival in a natural environment, the hypothesis that those items resulted from a single accident or mishap gradually lost its persuasiveness. The contradictions continued to become clearer when forensic psychological data revealed that Bianca carried submissive reflexes, avoidance, and fear responses tied to the presence of humans, particularly adult males, rather than the alertness to natural surroundings typically seen in individuals forced to fend for themselves in the wilderness. These characteristics, when placed alongside the old conclusions, created a stark break between the initial administrative hypothesis and the reality reflected by the new evidence. In light of the increasingly evident contradictions, authorities proceeded to adjust the case classification in accordance with established procedures, shifting it from a missing persons case with no criminal indicators to one involving suspected criminal elements. This reclassification was not based on emotion or a single detail, but was the result of the convergence of multiple independent data sources, including medical, psychological, statement analysis, and re-examination of physical evidence. Along with the change in classification, authority over the case was transferred from administrative missing persons units to specialized criminal investigation units, while evaluation criteria were also updated to align with the new nature of the matter. The focus of the investigation no longer centered on how Bianca might have encountered an accident in a natural environment, but shifted to identifying intentional human actions that led to her being deprived of freedom over an extended period. In the case review evaluation reports, the new investigative direction was clearly established as kidnapping and prolonged confinement, based on the consistency between signs of controlled living conditions, movement restriction, memory fragmentation, and psychological reflexes formed over time. The shift to a criminal investigation also meant the official elimination of the accident hypothesis that had dominated the initial decisions, acknowledging that the earlier conclusions, while reasonable given the limited data available at the time, no longer sufficed to explain the current reality. Bianca's missing persons file was fundamentally redefined, no longer viewed as a tragedy caused by nature, but as a case involving systematic deprivation of liberty, in which the 4-year period during which Bianca vanished from social life was no longer considered a random gap, but the consequence of a prolonged organized process of control that left clear traces on both the victim's physical body and psyche. After the file was officially transferred to a criminal investigation direction, Bianca's body became the central data source for environmental forensic scene tracing, an approach that allowed inference of the confinement location without relying on the victim's fragmented memory. Specialists began by analyzing the soil, rocks and plant material adhering to Bianca's body at the time she reappeared in Apache Junction, including microscopic particles still lodged in the folds of her clothing, on her scalp, under her fingernails, between her toes, and in other naturally hard-to-clean areas. These soil samples were classified by mineral composition, particle size, and color, revealing the presence of sediment types uncommon in the urban area where Bianca was found, but more consistent with semi-desert regions, featuring ancient geological layers, characterized by weathered sandstone and thin soil layers, rich in iron oxides. In parallel, small plant fragments clinging to fabric fibers and skin were collected and identified, including drought-resistant grasses, dry leaf fragments, and small thorns commonly found in areas with minimal human impact, suggesting Bianca had prolonged contact with a specific natural environment, but not in a state of continuous movement, like someone lost in the wilderness. Analysis of Bianca's clothing showed uneven wear concentrated in areas frequently in contact with hard surfaces, such as packed dirt or rough flooring, rather than random tears from moving through dense brush or rugged terrain, reinforcing the hypothesis that she had lived in a fixed space with a hard floor, possibly compacted earth or rock. Bianca's skin was also examined in detail, with signs of caulk-using, hardening and microtrauma in specific regions, reflecting repeated habitual activities in the same environment, rather than the constant changes of terrain seen in outdoor survival cases. Another key factor noted was the presence of deep-set dirt stains and soil pigments embedded in the skin and hair, indicating long-term accumulation rather than the result of a single event right before Bianca reappeared. In parallel psychological assessments, specialists collected unconscious drawings Bianca produced during non-directive therapy sessions, not aimed at reconstructing events, but at recording recurring spatial patterns emerging from her subconscious. These drawings frequently depicted enclosed spaces, clear boundary lines, contrasts between dark and light areas, and elements suggesting limited visibility, all of which were digitized and analyzed as supplementary data. When cross-referencing the spatial patterns from the drawings with environmental forensic data, analysts observed similarities between Bianca's spatial perception and areas in the Superstition Mountains and surrounding regions, featuring remote terrain, low natural light, and high potential for visual obstruction. The soil, rock and plant data were entered into a detailed topographic mapping system, where each sample was compared against areas with matching geological composition, gradually eliminating regions inconsistent with the recorded characteristics. This process was not intended to immediately pinpoint a specific location, but to narrow down suspect areas, based on the overlap of multiple independent factors, including soil composition, plant types, activity surface characteristics, and spatial patterns reflected in the unconscious drawings. As the data layers were overlaid, certain areas began to stand out more prominently than others, particularly those located off the main trails, showing signs of minimal human traffic, yet still accessible by rudimentary means. Environmental forensic specialists emphasized that these results did not constitute a definitive determination of the confinement location, but rather a scientifically grounded narrowing of the search perimeter, eliminating a wide range of prior hypotheses that had relied on speculation or lacked material evidence. Tracing the scene from the victim's body allowed investigators to shift from abstract inference to a trace evidence-based approach, where each soil particle, each plant fiber, and each physiological sign served as a piece of the overall picture. Although no specific location has yet been publicly disclosed or confirmed, the body-based tracing results have significantly reduced the scope of the investigation, shifting the focus from a vast and vague geographic area to a finite set of locations matching the documented characteristics. This narrowing is not conclusive, but sufficient to provide a clear analytical foundation, enabling the investigation to proceed in a more focused and controlled manner. On that foundation, The terrain analysis was implemented as an independent technical process, with the goal of systematically identifying and eliminating unsuitable geographic features, thereby highlighting spaces capable of sustaining prolonged confinement activities without detection over an extended period. The initial focus was on the system of natural rock caves and abandoned mines scattered throughout the mountainous region and adjacent areas, evaluated based on geological data, old mining records, and detailed topographic maps. Structures with unstable floors, high collapse risk, excessively narrow entrances, or insufficient living space were eliminated from the outset, while caves and tunnels featuring relatively flat floors, solid ceilings, natural ventilation, and signs of prior human activity were advanced to in-depth analysis. The evaluation did not stop at physical habitability, but also considered the degree of seclusion of access routes, the ability to obscure visibility from common trails, and the level of difficulty for random passers-by to detect. In parallel, the system of unofficial trails was analyzed as a key factor in long-term accessibility, including paths that formed spontaneously due to hunting, livestock grazing, or unregulated activities. These routes were assessed based on slope, vegetation cover, usability under various weather conditions, and distance to sparsely populated areas, to determine whether they would permit regular travel without leaving clear traces or attracting attention. Trails that intersected directly with tourist routes, or fell within easy line of sight, were excluded, as they failed to meet the necessary level of seclusion required to maintain covert operations. The elimination process continued with a review of all official tourist areas, including scenic viewpoints, parking lots, maintained climbing routes, and zones with scheduled patrols, where high human traffic and the presence of management personnel made long-term concealment unfeasible. These areas, despite complex terrain, were ruled out due to the natural monitoring effect of human presence. Another important criterion applied was the feasibility of access and sustained habitation over time, including the existence of a stable water source, natural drainage to prevent dampness, temperature regulation across different seasons, and sufficient isolation to limit the spread of noise, light, and odors into the surrounding environment. Locations accessible only during short periods of the year or entirely dependent on favorable weather were excluded, while areas offering relatively consistent year-round access were retained for further consideration. The assessment also included analysis of the potential to conceal signs of habitation, such as footprints, waste, or changes to vegetation, to determine whether a location could sustain long-term impact without producing easily recognizable evidence. These data were cross-referenced with information on land use rights, ownership history, and levels of human intervention, eliminating areas with regular landowner presence, periodic inspections, or legal factors that would complicate maintaining secrecy. Through this multi-layered review process, the analysis perimeter gradually narrowed to several key areas that converged on sufficient conditions for secluded terrain, stable access, and potential for enclosed spaces suitable for prolonged habitation. These areas were classified by degree of suitability based on the overlap of geological criteria, access routes, concealment potential, and environmental conditions, forming a clear priority list. On the basis of the identified key areas, preparations for on-site field examination were carried out in a detailed and cautious manner, including the development of safe access plans, comprehensive terrain risk assessments, selection of appropriate equipment for surveying enclosed spaces, and the establishment of protocols for documenting and preserving evidence in accordance with forensic standards, ensuring that all survey activities took place under strict control and with minimal risk of error. Once the necessary technical and safety conditions had been established, access to the suspect location was carried out, according to the approved field survey plan, with specialized teams moving along carefully selected approach routes to minimize environmental interference before precisely identifying the area requiring inspection. This area was situated deep within a rugged terrain zone, obscured by large rock formations, steep cliffs, and uneven natural vegetation, making observation from a distance nearly impossible with the naked eye. Upon entering the suspect perimeter, investigators noticed minor anomalies in the terrain structure, including unnatural arrangements of rocks and soil at certain points, suggesting the possible existence of a concealed space. After eliminating natural factors that could cause confusion, a low and narrow entrance gradually came into view, camouflaged with loose debris and dry vegetation, showing no obvious signs of recent human intervention yet clearly indicating prior human arrangement. This entrance did not match the characteristics of a temporary shelter cave or random rest stop, as it was arranged to restrict external visibility and control the flow of light entering inside. Upon approaching the interior space, investigators discovered a stable hidden structure with a low ceiling, enclosed space, and a layout indicating long-term use. Signs of prolonged habitation were clearly evident. The ground was compacted along fixed movement paths, rock surfaces showed concentrated wear at specific points, and the presence of rudimentary materials placed in fixed positions reflected repetitive daily activities rather than short-term use. The space demonstrated severe restrictions on movement capability, with ceiling heights forcing occupants to crouch or move slowly, narrow passages preventing flexible posture changes, and limited visibility in certain angles, creating a sense of enclosure and control. These features aligned closely with the signs of movement restriction and physiological adaptations previously documented on Bianca's body, establishing a clear connection between the physical space and the victim's condition. Investigators proceeded to document the entire spatial structure through photographs, diagrams, and measurements to accurately recreate the layout and dimensions of the suspect site. In parallel, the collection of physical evidence was conducted in accordance with forensic standards, focusing on traces reflecting long-term human presence and activity, including soil samples from main activity areas, remnants of organic and inorganic materials, and signs of repeated impact on rock surfaces and ground. Each sample was numbered, its precise location recorded, and individually packaged to ensure integrity and traceability. Notably, certain interior areas showed evidence of light and sound control, with surfaces arranged to reduce sound reflection and limit incoming light, consistent with the need to conceal habitation activities from the external environment. Investigators also noted that the space lacked signs of random natural survival, such as makeshift outdoor fire pits or scattered waste along movement paths, and instead, all traces were concentrated within a narrow area, indicating activity confined to a fixed zone. After completing the initial documentation and evidence collection, the inspection perimeter was expanded in a controlled manner to determine whether secondary spaces, alternative access routes, or storage areas related to long-term use of the site existed. Any secondary passages, if present, were documented and assessed for consistency with the overall structure of the location. Once the primary elements had been identified, and the space was deemed to hold exceptional investigative value, the scene was officially sealed in accordance with legal regulations, with clearly established protective boundaries to prevent unauthorized entry and preserve the original state of physical traces. Sealing the scene served not only to protect the evidence already collected, but also marked the moment when the suspect location was formally recognized as a central space in reconstructing the prolonged confinement process, as the material signs, spatial layout, and traces of habitation were sufficient to form a consistent picture of a controlled environment that had existed over an extended period. From this point, the examination of the confinement scene was conducted with a high level of detail, first focusing on analyzing the spatial layout to reconstruct how this location had been organized, used, and maintained over a long period. Specialists precisely measured the overall dimensions, ceiling height, passage widths, intersection points, and areas hidden from view, thereby identifying the physical boundaries the confined person faced daily. The spatial layout revealed a minimal but intentional division, with basic functional areas arranged to restrict movement to fixed trajectories, forcing the occupant to adapt to narrow passages, low ceilings, and severely limited lines of sight. This organization not only physically restricted movement, but also created a sense of enclosure, loss of control, and complete dependence on the surrounding space. Clear signs of light control were documented through the narrow entrance, indirect light direction, and the complete absence of direct natural light in most of the space, making the boundary between day and night blurred for the confined person. This light control was considered a key factor in disrupting time perception, consistent with the time disorientation symptoms recorded in Bianca. Alongside light, evidence of food control appeared through limited storage areas, traces of small, monotonous, and repetitive portion distribution, indicating the goal was not full health maintenance, but keeping the body in a minimal survival state, sufficient to live but prone to debilitation and dependency. These traces included a lack of variety in living materials, the absence of complex cooking implements, and signs of portion allocation in consistent but low quantities. From the accumulated sediment layers on the ground, the degree of rock surface wear, and the formation of familiar paths, specialists estimated the duration of use for this space. The results indicated continuous use over a prolonged period, long enough to produce lasting changes to surface structures and the microenvironment, changes that could not form in just a few weeks or months. The uniformity of the traces suggested the confinement occurred without significant interruption, with daily activities repeating at a stable rhythm, reflecting deliberate maintenance of confinement conditions across multiple seasons. Analysis of the perpetrator's behavior through the scene focused on how spatial elements were used as control tools, from selecting a hard-to-reach yet not overly remote location to sustain supply capability, to organizing the space to minimize detection risk. The signs indicated the perpetrator possessed practical knowledge of the terrain and concealment techniques, while making calculated decisions aimed at maintaining secrecy and stability, rather than convenience or short-term efficiency. The restriction of light, control of food, and confinement of movement space reflected a behavioral pattern designed to gradually erode the confined person's autonomy while reinforcing both physical and psychological dependence. When the scene's features were cross-referenced with the documented manifestations in Bianca, the compatibility became evident, from movement restriction and prolonged malnutrition to submissive reflexes and time disorientation. The confinement environment reconstructed from the scene provided a consistent explanation for these physiological and psychological consequences, ruling out the possibility that they resulted from a random accident or natural survival conditions. The tight linkage between the scene and the victim's manifestations allowed analysts to establish a causal relationship between the confinement conditions and Bianca's current state. From a forensic perspective, every detail in the scene was placed in relation to other data to complete the criminal profile, not merely describing the place of confinement, but inferring daily routines, level of supervision, and potential points of interaction between perpetrator and victim. This profile integrated spatial material and behavioral data into a logical analytical structure, with the scene serving as physical evidence, reflecting a systematic series of decisions. Completing the criminal profile based on scene examination was not intended to construct a speculative narrative, but to establish verifiable objective connections between spatial layout, control methods, and the long-term consequences observed, thereby forming a solid, testable analytical foundation within the framework of the criminal investigation into unlawful confinement. On the basis of these connections, the focus of analysis shifted from describing the scene to explaining the methods and motives behind the criminal behavior. From that point, the analysis of the criminal methods and motives was constructed based on the synthesis of physical evidence at the scene, medical and psychological evaluations, and the inferred behavioral model derived from the way the confinement space was organized and maintained, revealing this to be a deliberate, long-term control behavior fundamentally distinct from impulsive or random acts of violence. The core method identified was survival isolation, in which the victim was completely severed from the social world, familiar environments, and all independent sources of support, placed into an enclosed space where every essential element of survival was under the perpetrator's control. This isolation did not occur through overt coercion or direct physical violence, but through the establishment of an environment that left the victim with no alternative but to adapt and become dependent. The mechanism for creating dependency was constructed in a sophisticated manner, based on the minimal but consistent provision of basic needs such as food, water, and light, enough to sustain life but insufficient to restore health or a sense of security. This controlled deprivation gradually eroded the victim's physical and mental autonomy, forcing them to tie their very existence to the presence and decisions of the controller. The control of light played a crucial role in blurring the boundary between day and night, disrupting time perception, while food control created a state of prolonged debilitation, reducing resistance capability and increasing dependency. The restricted movement space, with low ceilings, narrow passages, and severely limited visibility, not only constrained physical motion, but also generated a constant feeling of being surrounded, making it difficult for the victim to form any notion of escape. Notably, the analysis found no evidence of frequent direct violence, such as physical torture or acute injuries, because such acts carried high risk, were likely to leave visible traces, and could disrupt the long-term stability of the control system. Instead, violence was transformed into environmental violence, where deprivation, monotony, and control themselves became the tools of prolonged harm, without the need for overt coercive acts. Avoiding direct violence also allowed the perpetrator to maintain secrecy and reduce the risk of detection, while enabling a durable control process over time. When analyzing James's motives based on this behavioral model, experts concluded that the central motive did not stem from material gain or immediate gratification, but from a deep need for control tied to an unresolved personal loss. Behavioral signs indicated that James sought a distorted relationship in which the victim was stripped of autonomy and gradually became a dependent entity, thereby fulfilling the perpetrator's need for emotional control and a sense of possession. The absence of direct violence permitted James to maintain a self-rationalization mechanism in which the controlling behavior was reinterpreted as care, protection, or keeping safe, a form of psychological rationalization commonly observed in long-term control offenders. This mechanism helped the perpetrator reduce internal conflict and sustain the behavior over an extended period, without viewing himself as the harm doer. The model of long-term control crime is characterized by patience, calculation, and a high capacity for behavioral discipline, prioritizing the stability of the control system over impulsive actions. Decisions regarding the confinement location, spatial arrangement, levels of food and light provision all reflected a consistent strategy aimed at maximizing victim dependency while minimizing detection risk. When this model was placed alongside Bianca's psychological manifestations, such as submissive reflexes, avoidance, dissociation, and conditioned fear, the compatibility became evident, showing that the method had successfully shaped the victim's behavior and perception toward prolonged dependency. Defining the nature of the criminal behavior, therefore, extended beyond the mere concept of unlawful confinement. It was identified as a systematic prolonged chain of control actions that caused severe physical and psychological harm, sustained through environmental and psychological tools, rather than overt violence. The consistency between the methods, motives, and consequences made it clear that this was a form of long-term control crime, where the criminal act did not exist as a single event, but was organized into a deliberate, designed, operated, and persistently maintained control structure, aimed at usurping the victim's autonomy and compensating for the perpetrator's emotional deficiencies. Once the structural nature of the behavior had been clarified, the analysis could not stop at motives or intentions, but needed to delve deeper into how that control system was implemented in everyday life. On this basis, the process of confinement and abuse was reconstructed as a self-contained, continuously operating system over a long period, in which each element of control was arranged to gradually weaken both the physical and psychological state of the victim, without resorting to overt, impulsive direct violence. Control over food intake played a central role in this system, with portions maintained at a minimal, monotonous, and nutritionally imbalanced level, enough to sustain life, but insufficient to restore health or create a sense of satiety. Food was not provided on a stable schedule, but depended entirely on the controller's decisions, creating a prolonged state of uncertainty that kept the victim in constant anticipation, anxiety, and dependency. The extended energy deficit, reduced strength, limited mobility, and weakened defensive reflexes, while directly impacting mood and concentration ability. In parallel with food control, Forced labor was documented as a regular part of daily routine, not aimed at generating economic value, but at maintaining the confinement space and serving the controller's basic needs. These tasks were repetitive, monotonous and physically draining, performed under conditions of poor nutrition and without reasonable rest periods, causing the victim's body to fall into a state of chronic fatigue. The enforcement of labor required no explicit threats or overt physical violence, because the dependency on food and survival conditions alone was sufficient to create pressure to comply. When labor became the condition for maintaining even minimal needs, the boundary between routine activity and coercion blurred, making it difficult for the victim to clearly perceive the extent of the harm being inflicted. Psychological punishment was used as a behavioral adjustment tool through measures such as extended periods of isolation, sudden changes to daily routines, or the withdrawal of small comforting or familiar elements. These forms of punishment left no clear physical traces, but generated continuous psychological pressure, instilling feelings of insecurity, guilt, and fear, keeping the victim in a constant state of tension, awaiting possible harm. The lack of consistent rules in punishment further heightened the sense of loss of control, forcing the victim to adjust behavior toward submission to avoid risk. Over time, these forms of control and abuse accumulated into profound damage, not only physically, such as malnutrition, muscle loss, and movement restriction, but also psychologically, with the formation of defensive coping mechanisms. The body gradually adapted to deprivation by reducing movement demands and conserving energy, while the psyche developed responses such as dissociation, avoidance, and submission to minimize suffering. These reactions initially helped the victim survive in the harsh environment, but in the long term, became sources of lasting trauma, diminishing autonomy, and the capacity for reintegration. The accumulation of harm occurred silently, yet continuously, with each passing day reinforcing the state of dependency and debilitation, gradually blurring the boundary between normal and abnormal in the victim's perception. The long-term psychological consequences of this confinement process manifested in complex disorders, including conditioned fear, automatic submissive reflexes, difficulty trusting others, and challenges in re-establishing a sense of safety. These manifestations cannot be explained by a single event, but reflect the cumulative impact of a prolonged controlled environment, where every aspect of life was adjusted according to another person's will. The combination of food control, forced labor, and psychological punishment formed a closed loop, in which each element served as both cause and consequence of the others, escalating the severity of the criminal behavior over time. The absence of frequent direct violence did not diminish the abusive nature. On the contrary, it revealed the sophistication and calculation in the methods of inflicting harm, as the victim was weakened and made dependent, without actions likely to be detected. This process was sustained through stability and repetition, making it difficult for the victim to fully recognize the extent of the violation, or to imagine escape, because daily existence itself had become tied to compliance. When considered overall, the process of confinement and abuse cannot be viewed as a series of isolated actions, but must be understood as a deliberate system, where every element contributes to reinforcing control and deepening harm. Assessing the severity of the criminal behavior, therefore, relies not only on the documented physical and psychological consequences, but also on the prolonged systematic and intentional nature of this process, demonstrating a profound violation of human rights and the victim's integrity that far exceeds what can be explained by random or impulsive acts. The identification and arrest of James were carried out after the disparate data from the scene. Medical evaluations, psychological analysis, and behavioral model were consolidated into a structured suspect profile, in which each element of control, space, and time was linked by clear causal relationships. The suspect profile was built not on isolated speculation, but on the overlap between physical signs at the confinement site, patterns of long-term control, and the victim's adaptive manifestations, allowing the scope to be narrowed to an individual with access to the terrain, the ability to maintain secrecy, and the capacity to meet logistical requirements over an extended period. This process included reviewing individuals who had been present or resided in the vicinity of the suspect areas, cross-referencing travel history, land use rights, freelance labor activities, and the ability to obtain supplies without leaving clear traces. Individuals whose schedules aligned with the confinement period, who possessed local knowledge, and who exhibited reclusive living patterns were advanced for deeper scrutiny. As James's profile gradually emerged, investigators focused on linking scene evidence to suspect-related data, including compatibility between skills, lifestyle habits, and the manner in which the confinement space was organized. The collected physical traces were compared against traceable supply sources, showing consistency between James's access capabilities and the materials used in the confinement space. At the same time, indirect data such as movement patterns, periods of absence from public activity locations, and changes in social behavior were correlated with the phases of sustained confinement, reinforcing the suspicion that James was the only individual who fully met all established criteria. When the level of certainty reached the necessary legal threshold, the file was submitted to obtain an arrest warrant, with evidence arranged in logical sequence to demonstrate a direct connection between the suspect and the prolonged confinement behavior. The arrest warrant was issued once all legal conditions were fully established, reflecting the case's shift from an inferential investigation phase to grounded criminal prosecution. The arrest operation was planned in detail to ensure the safety of participating personnel and to minimize risk to the community, with timing and location selected based on behavioral analysis to reduce the likelihood of resistance or evidence destruction. When law enforcement approached and executed the arrest, James had no opportunity to evade, and the restraint process was carried out swiftly while fully complying with current legal procedures. In parallel with the arrest, the seizure of related property was implemented to preserve and expand the evidence system, including items, documents, and vehicles potentially linked to the maintenance of the confinement space and victim control. Each seized item was documented, sealed, and preliminarily assessed to determine its probative value, while also being cross-referenced with traces collected at the scene to strengthen the direct connection. The seizure of property was not only intended to prove that the criminal act had occurred, but also to rule out alternative hypotheses that could weaken the prosecution file. After James was placed in custody, the investigation phase was structurally completed, with evidence chains closed and causal relationships clearly established. At this point, the case file reflected a systematic investigation process in which medical, psychological, scene and behavioral data converged into a consistent picture of prolonged confinement behavior. The completion of the investigation did not signify the end of the case's impact, but it marked the moment when criminal responsibility was individualized, shifting the focus from establishing objective truth to the legal processing of the accused. The event of James's arrest was therefore not merely the result of a single law enforcement action, but the convergence point of a prolonged analytical process, where every small detail was accumulated, cross-referenced, and verified, ensuring that when the suspect was placed under the control of the law, the file was solid enough to withstand the rigorous scrutiny standards of the judicial system. The legal proceedings were initiated after the investigation concluded, with the filing of an indictment based on a tightly structured evidence framework, in which the prolonged unlawful confinement, systematic control, and severe physical and psychological harm were identified as the central focus of criminal accountability. The indictment was not constructed to depend on a single testimony or one decisive direct piece of evidence, but rather on the convergence of multiple mutually supportive groups of indirect evidence, including scene data, results from the living forensic medical evaluation, forensic psychological analysis, the criminal behavioral model, and items seized during the arrest. During the trial, the biggest point of contention centered on the reliability of the victim's testimony, as Bianca was unable to provide a coherent, complete account of the timeline, locations, and specific details throughout her confinement. The defense exploited the fragmented nature of her memory, cognitive gaps, and dissociation phenomena to argue that the testimony did not meet the required standard of accuracy for conviction. In response to these arguments, the prosecution did not place Bianca's testimony at the decisive center, but presented it as a valuable experiential data source used for guidance, cross-checking, and corroboration through other objective evidence. Prosecutors emphasized that in cases of prolonged confinement, fragmented testimony is a common consequence of psychological trauma, not an indication of dishonesty. The prosecution's main presentation therefore shifted to the system of indirect evidence, arranged in a causal logic, to demonstrate that the harm to the victim's body and mind could only have formed in a prolonged controlled environment. Medical data were presented to show chronic malnutrition, movement restriction, and untreated old injuries consistent with long-term confinement, ruling out the possibility of wilderness disorientation or short-term accident. In parallel, scene analyses were used to prove the existence of an enclosed living space with evidence of light, food, and movement control, reflecting the deliberate maintenance of a confinement environment. The role of forensic psychological experts was pivotal during the trial, as they explained to the court the nature of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation phenomena, and submissive reflexes formed in the context of long-term control. The experts clarified that victims of such behaviors often lose the ability to organize memories in a linear sequence, easily confuse time markers, and struggle to articulate experiences coherently, but these very characteristics are indicators of prolonged trauma. This expert analysis helped the jury understand that evaluating the testimony could not apply ordinary standards, as with non-traumatized witnesses, but needed to be placed within the victim's specific psychological context. Throughout the trial, evidence was presented in an interconnected manner, with each data group linked to the others, to create a closed argumentative structure in which alternative hypotheses were systematically eliminated. The jury was asked to consider the entire picture of evidence, from scene conditions, victim manifestations, to the defendant's behavior and access capabilities, rather than evaluating each element in isolation. This presentation aimed to prove that no other reasonable scenario could simultaneously explain all the established facts, except the hypothesis of deliberate unlawful confinement. After the conclusion of the adversarial proceedings, the court proceeded to assess criminal responsibility, based on the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, in which indirect evidence was deemed sufficiently strong when it was consistent, tightly interconnected, and led to a single unavoidable conclusion. The court's finding determined that James's conduct constituted the crime of prolonged unlawful confinement and control, with the level of severity established based on the duration of confinement, the systematic nature of the control measures, and the cumulative consequences for the victim. Establishing criminal responsibility extended beyond the mere deprivation of physical liberty to include the severe violation of Bianca's autonomy, dignity, and capacity for independent living over an extended period. This legal process reflected the transformation of the case from a complex investigation into a trial, in which legal and scientific standards were applied to evaluate the criminal conduct in its full context, affirming that even in the absence of direct violence or traditional witnesses, prolonged control and silent abuse can still be proven and prosecuted when grounded in a logical, objective, and consistent evidence system. The verdict was announced after the jury completed its full deliberation process, marking the moment when James's criminal responsibility was officially and irreversibly established within the framework of federal law. The court concluded that the evidence presented fully met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, demonstrating that James had carried out a systematic series of criminal acts over many years, with the goal of absolute control and the deprivation of the victim's autonomy. On that basis, James was convicted of serious charges, including kidnapping, prolonged unlawful confinement, coercion of survival under controlled conditions, abuse causing severe physical and mental harm, along with related offenses that reflected the continuous and intentional nature of the criminal conduct. When pronouncing the charges, the court emphasized that this was not a single act or a momentary lapse, but a sustained criminal process that was deliberate and calculated, in which every decision contributed to prolonging the victim's dependency and harm. The sentence imposed was 45 years in federal prison, with no eligibility for early parole, reflecting the court's assessment of the particularly dangerous nature of long-term control behavior and the extensive consequences it caused. The application of a high-end sentence was not intended as revenge, but to ensure proportionality between the degree of violation of human rights and the criminal sanction, while also expressing the view that behaviors that do not involve direct violence, but cause prolonged harm, can and must be severely punished. In the sentencing remarks, the judge clearly analyzed that the key aggravating factor was the extended duration of confinement, the systematic nature of the control measures, and the fact that the victim was psychologically immature at the time of the abduction, severely limiting her ability to resist or protect herself. The court also rejected all arguments for leniency based on the absence of acute injuries or direct physical violence, affirming that environmental and psychological abuse can cause profound and lasting damage that is no less severe, and in some cases even more serious, than physical harm. The long-term legal consequences of the verdict were clearly established, including James's obligation to serve the full term of imprisonment, as pronounced without the possibility of early release, along with permanent legal obligations and restrictions associated with being convicted of serious violent crimes. These consequences include strict supervision measures in the event of any eventual release, absolute prohibitions on contact or proximity to vulnerable individuals, and mandatory registration requirements under federal regulations to protect the community. The court stressed that these consequences were not only punitive, but also preventive, aimed at minimizing the risk of recidivism and affirming the justice system's responsibility to safeguard the fundamental rights of citizens. In the final statement of the verdict, the court acknowledged that the harm Bianca endured did not end with James's conviction, because the psychological and physiological consequences of the prolonged confinement would continue to affect her life for many years, possibly for the rest of her life. The sentencing was therefore seen not only as punishment for the individual offender, but also as the law's official recognition of the severity of the invisible yet enduring harm the victim had suffered and continued to bear. The 45-year federal prison sentence was deemed necessary to fully reflect the systematic, prolonged, and destructive nature of the criminal conduct, while sending a clear message that any form of controlling another human being by depriving them of autonomy and survival exceeds the limits acceptable to society and the law. After the verdict was pronounced, the criminal prosecution process officially concluded, with all necessary legal procedures completed and recorded in the federal justice system. The closing of the proceedings marked the moment when legal truth was definitively established, criminal responsibility was individualized, and the sentence was put into execution, bringing to a close a lengthy trial phase, while leaving deep legal and social consequences. This verdict is regarded as the outcome of a rigorous investigation and trial process, in which scientific, legal, and human rights standards were applied comprehensively to evaluate the criminal conduct in its full context, thereby affirming that even silent, prolonged, and unobtrusive forms of abuse can be brought to light and severely punished when proven through a consistent and robust system of evidence. However, the sentencing and conclusion of the prosecution process only marked the legal end of the case, not the closure of the consequences left by the criminal act. From this point, the aftermath and current condition of Bianca are viewed as a prolonged and complex process in which the termination of confinement and the court's verdict do not mean that the physical, psychological, and social harms have ceased in reality. Physically, Bianca entered recovery with a severely weakened health foundation due to chronic malnutrition, prolonged movement restriction, and untreated old injuries, requiring a long recovery period and continuous medical intervention. Medical evaluations noted reduced endurance, metabolic disorders, and residual effects impacting the cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and digestive systems, necessitating a coordinated treatment program involving physical rehabilitation, nutrition, and regular medical monitoring. Alongside physical issues, Bianca's psychological state reflected the profound consequences of prolonged trauma, with typical manifestations of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, including avoidance, conditioned fear reflexes, difficulty regulating emotions, and episodes of dissociation triggered by reminders. The long-term treatment process therefore focused not only on symptom stabilization, but also on re-establishing a sense of safety, restoring autonomy, and rebuilding self-perception in an environment no longer under control. Psychological experts determined that treatment would proceed in stages, with slow and non-linear progress, where periods of improvement often alternated with symptom flare-ups when Bianca faced social situations or related memories. In that context, family relationships after Bianca's reappearance served as both a source of support and a complex challenge. The family had to confront the reality that Bianca did not return as the person she was before disappearing, but as an individual, profoundly changed in how she perceived the world and interacted with those around her. Efforts to reconnect took place with caution, as familiar relationships needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, with respect for the new psychological boundaries formed after trauma. Emotional closeness could not be restored instantly, and expectations of a complete return were gradually adjusted to align with the reality of long-term recovery. During this process, Bianca had to learn to live in an environment where self-determination was restored, yet accompanied by the pressure of making choices, directing her own life, things that had been taken away for many years and now became significant psychological challenges. Reality shows that Bianca could not recover fully in the sense of returning to her pre-confinement state, because the accumulated damage had become an inseparable part of her life experience. The lack of full recovery does not equate to failure, but reflects the realistic limits of healing after prolonged trauma, where the goal is not to erase memories or consequences entirely, but to learn to live with them in a more stable state. Legally, the case file was closed after the sentence took effect, and all necessary procedural steps were completed, marking the end of the criminal accountability process. However, closing the file did not diminish the ongoing need to support the victim, as obligations for medical, psychological, and social care continued as part of the long-term responsibility for the case's consequences. The social aftermath of the case persists through discussions about the nature of control behaviors that do not involve direct violence, about how the legal system and community recognize these silent yet persistent forms of abuse. The case became a typical example, showing that danger does not always manifest through overt violence, but can hide in prolonged control structures, where harm accumulates gradually over time. For Bianca, her current life is a continuous process of adaptation, where every small step forward carries meaning, yet comes with the awareness that what was lost cannot be fully reclaimed. Her present condition reflects a complex reality, in which survival and recovery coexist with unhealed wounds, and continuing to live becomes a long journey, requiring patience, support, and acceptance. The echo of the case therefore lies not only in the sentence pronounced, but also in how society perceives and responds to the long-term consequences of control crimes, where recognition, understanding, and sustained support become key factors for the victim to build a feasible future within the limits of the trauma endured. Bianca's story is not just a case closed in judicial files, but a mirror reflecting very real gaps in today's American life, where individual freedom is highly valued, yet sophisticated forms of control can still exist right in the middle of a civilized society. Bianca was not held by chains or overt violence, but through survival isolation, food control, light restriction, and the gradual stripping away of her right to self-determination. These details show that the greatest danger does not always come from loud actions, but from silent, prolonged, and hard-to-detect structures of control. The first lesson for American society is the need to expand the concept of violence and abuse. It is not only beating or threatening that constitutes a crime, but controlling someone's life, isolating a person from family, community, and the right to choose can also destroy a lifetime. Second, Bianca's story shows why we should not doubt victims simply because their accounts are fragmented and lack coherence. In reality, as the experts in this case pointed out, it is precisely prolonged trauma that causes memory to shatter, and demanding a perfect story can unintentionally become a second form of violence. The third lesson is community-oriented. Social vigilance should not stop at easily visible violence, but needs to pay attention to signs such as unusual isolation, extreme dependency, or an individual gradually disappearing from relationships. Finally, the 45-year prison sentence given to James underscores a core value of modern America: individual freedom and human dignity are inviolable. Justice cannot give Bianca back the years she lost, but her story reminds us that protecting people is not only about punishing the guilty, but also about learning to listen, trust, and intervene in time before silent control becomes a prolonged tragedy. If you believe that stories like Bianca's need to be heard to help society better understand these silent, yet devastating forms of harm, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in even more authentic and in-depth case files. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video, where every story is not just a case, but a reminder of the value of freedom and human dignity.